Today we turn to the ugly side of politics, conflict among groups. Obviously, the first thing you need for intergroup conflict is different groups. Therefore, one key variable to take into account in analyzing political conflict is the degree of homogeneity or heterogeneity in the state. These are just fancy terms for diversity or a lack thereof. A homogeneous state does not have many different groups. Homogeneous means the same, or made up of similar parts. Here, of course, those parts are people or groups. So a homogeneous state, like for example Japan, consists primarily of citizens of the same ethnic, racial, and religious groups. Thus, while there are certainly lines of political conflict in Japan, the sort of intense identity conflict we are talking about today is less likely. The opposite of homogeneous is heterogeneous. Something that is heterogeneous is made up of many different kinds of things. So a heterogeneous state consists of very different identity groups. Basically, heterogeneity means diversity. Heterogeneous states like the US, Nigeria, and India include many different racial, linguistic, ethnic, and religious groups. This can create tensions. Another way to look at this is to ask how many cleavages exist in a society. You will recall that a social cleavage does not necessarily translate automatically into a political cleavage, but cleavages certainly are the raw material of identity conflict in politics. Measuring cleavages can be a tricky endeavor. The theorists who proposed the idea of social and political cleavages, Lipset and Rokon, argue that there are four basic kinds of cleavages that tend to become politicized. The economic cleavage between the owners of capital and workers, the geographic cleavage between the state's center or dominant group and its periphery or subgroups, the cleavage between urban industrial populations and rural agricultural populations, and the religious cleavage between the church and its supporters and the advocates of a secular state. These four primary cleavages were proposed with Western European politics in mind, so it's a bit narrow if we want to think about politics all over the world, especially in developing and highly ethnically diverse states. Thus, political scientists tend to go beyond these in measuring heterogeneity. The most common measure focuses on ethno-linguistic fractionalization, which is essentially a measure of the probability that two individuals drawn at random from the state's population will be of a different ethnic or linguistic group. Of course, this measure is highly controversial, both in terms of how to crunch the numbers and as a theoretical construct. Moreover, you'll remember that the constructivist would point out that these identities can be really hard to measure in a way that is stable across cases, because what might constitute a different identity in one place doesn't in another. For instance, most Americans would look at a Slovak and a Hungarian and just say they're both part of the same group, namely white people. The Slovak and the Hungarian, however, would vehemently disagree. The take-home point for us is that, as is so often the case in political science, measurement issues are very difficult, and different measures can lead to very different conclusions. One of the key factors in explaining both heterogeneity within states and the likelihood of conflict within and between states has to do with the overlap, or lack thereof, of state and national boundaries. Remember, the state is a political unit, while the nation is a cultural group with a perceived sameness who aspire to some degree of political autonomy, voice, or self-determination. This means that states, including multiple nations, or nations without states, provide ample raw material for political conflict. A big reason for the disjuncture of state and national boundaries has to do with the legacy of colonialism. Basically, a lot of the modern political borders in the world were drawn by colonial authorities, who may or may not have tried to get political and national boundaries to line up. Of course, they weren't exactly faced with an easy task. You can see in this map to the left, which is an attempt to place all of the ethnic groups in Africa geographically, that it was a very heterogeneous place to start out with. On the right you can see the juxtaposition of the old colonial boundaries from the time when pretty much the entire continent was carved out by the big European empires, and the current political boundaries showing the states of Africa today. By comparing the two, you can tell that the colonial boundaries pretty much determined the current political boundaries, and by comparing the two, you can probably see pretty quickly that the cultural and political boundaries are quite different. There are many states with multiple ethno-linguistic groups, and there are many ethno-linguistic groups whose populations are divided among many states. Here you can get a little more detail on West Africa, and you can see how heterogeneous so many of these states are. And indeed and unfortunately, many of these states have played host to tragic intergroup conflicts and civil war. But it is not just that the colonial powers didn't care to try and line up ethnic and cultural boundaries when drawing up the political map of their former empires, though that may have been the case in some circumstances. In many cases, different groups are so marbled together that it would be virtually impossible to sort them all out and give them their own state. Indeed, since the First World War, which many blamed upon exactly this problem of the disjuncture between the political boundaries of the state and the social and cultural boundaries of nations, there has been a strong international push to allow national populations self-determination, giving each nation its own political unit in the form of what we now call the nation-state. A perfect nation-state is simply a state that includes one nation. But look here to the left at this map of the major groups in the Balkans, a geographic region in the south of Europe that you may remember from high school history as the, quote, powder keg of Europe. There is such diversity there that it is tough to imagine how to give each group its own state. For a long time, a large swath of this region was all part of the same state, Yugoslavia, but following that state's dissolution, a period of brutal civil war and genocide followed. Here you can see the ethnic makeup of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Geographically, this is a very small country, and is actually just a hair smaller than West Virginia. But you can see that the ethno-linguistic makeup of this state is incredibly diverse, so knowing how to draw a nation-state here is nearly impossible. Another key to understanding where intergroup conflict is severe within a state, and where it can be ameliorated, is to think about what is called cleavage structure. Thus, it's not just about the number of social cleavages in a state, but also about how these cleavages are distributed among the populace. One possibility is that cleavages are overlapping. When cleavages overlap, members of each side of one of the cleavages will tend to be on the same side of another. Think of this example of a hypothetical country with a few different important social cleavages: religion, class, urban-rural, and language. Here these divisions overlap and reinforce one another, such that if a person is Sunni Muslim, he will tend to be an urban resident of the upper class who speaks Arabic, while if a person is a Shia Muslim, he will tend to be a rural, lower-class speaker of Farsi. Thus, these two people have very little common ground between them, and this makes the opportunity for conflict greater. The European state of Belgium is a real-world example of overlapping cleavages and the difficulties involved. The country is relatively cleanly divided between a Flemish, Dutch-speaking north and a Wallonian, French-speaking south, and these two groups feel themselves to be very different culturally and historically, and they inhabit pretty distinct regions. This has created great conflict, and despite efforts to design a social democratic system to represent each group and facilitate cooperation and mutual understanding, Belgium has had some incredible problems dealing with this division. Indeed, for literally years the state did not have an official government because the two sides could not agree on how to work out a coalition government, as is necessary in Belgium's parliamentary political system. Somewhat surprisingly, cross-cutting cleavages tend to minimalize or ameliorate identity conflict. When cleavage is cross-cut, it means that somebody on one side of cleavage A is not really more likely to be on a given side of a different cleavage. Let's take the example of a state with two primary cleavages: language and religion. If these were overlapping, it would mean that all Arabic speakers would be of one religion and vice versa. But in our hypothetical situation here, these cleavages cross-cut, meaning that a bunch of the Arabic speakers are Sunni Muslim, and a bunch of them are Shia, and likewise a Farsi speaker might be Sunni and might be Shia. This helps lessen the potential for conflict because it creates more common ground among the members of various groups, and makes it harder to tell who is part of your group and who is part of another group. For instance, if it was as easy as all Shia are Arabic-speaking and I am a Farsi-speaking Sunni, they would all seem really different from me. However, if a bunch of the Shia are Farsi-speaking and a bunch of the Sunni are Arabic-speaking, it becomes less clear that they are uniformly so different. A good real-world example of the phenomenon of cross-cutting cleavages is India, which is one of the world's most diverse states. India has over 20 official languages in addition to English, which, because of British colonial rule and the need for communication across so many groups, has become the predominant language of administration. It is also extremely religiously diverse, with a majority of Hindu, but also very significant Muslim, Christian, Sikh, and Buddhist communities. The caste system also divided Indian society into multiple complicated social groups, and different regions also have their own identities. For the most part, these countless groups are marbled together, so the cleavages cross-cut one another. Some political scientists, notably the pioneers of cleavage theory, Lipset and Rokan, have argued that this helps account for the success of Indian democracy. Many analysts were skeptical that Indian democracy could succeed because of the enormous diversity of the country and its widespread economic poverty. Remember, the modernization hypothesis would predict that democracy should do best in wealthy countries, and especially at the time of India's democratization following World War II, it was a very, very poor state. Indeed, India has always been one of the surprising counterexamples that critics of the modernization hypothesis point to. The fact that the cleavage structure of Indian society is so cross-cutting has helped lessen some potential lines of conflict, though of course there are limits, as demonstrated by some growing conflict between Hindu and Muslim religious groups in certain Indian states. Finally, let's examine just a couple more factors that can increase the likelihood of intergroup conflict. The first is relative deprivation. This term refers to grievances and feelings that another group has something that they do not deserve, or that is rightfully your group's. Basically, it's a feeling that they are taking too much and that it's not fair, and thus they are depriving you and yours. This is a psychological theory that places an emphasis on relativity. Thus, it's not about the absolute objective level of goodies that each group has, but about how they see their own level of goodies as compared to other groups, and whether they subjectively evaluate that as fair. As Marx put it, a house may be large or small. As long as the neighboring houses are likewise small, it satisfies all social requirement for a residence. But let there arise next to the little house a palace, and the little house shrinks to a hut. Basic idea is that it's all relative. How you feel about what you have kind of depends upon how you feel about what others have. Of course, there is a general propensity to feel like we don't have as much as we deserve while they have more. Moreover, this can be about more than competition over scarce resources. It can be more value-based, such as the feeling that another group is seen as being immoral, lazy, or simply unworthy. Thus, we can get into scary territory of dehumanization, which is the first step to acts of unspeakable atrocity. Another important facilitating factor for intergroup conflict is mutual fear of one another. Of course, anger and hatred are often seen as the key culprits, and they are certainly important, but a lot of the time conflict can be primarily a matter of mutual fear and a lack of trust. This is often known as the security dilemma, which is a scenario in which two groups distrust and fear one another, which may lead to conflict when one group decides that they should strike early, lest they be caught unprepared. Both fear and feelings of relative deprivation are particularly dangerous because they make people more vulnerable to appeals from fear-mongering politicians, who may try to capitalize off of conflict in order to increase their own political power or distract from their own dirty laundry. One of the most famous and tragic examples of some of the themes from this section of our course at work is the Rwandan genocide. A genocide is the deliberate and systematic attempt on the part of one group to eradicate another. It's a situation that humanity has witnessed tragically all too many times in the modern era. The Rwandan genocide was particularly dramatic for how quickly it happened. In a relatively short period of time, an estimated 800,000 Rwandans of the Tutsi group, and possibly up to 1 million, were butchered. This tragedy is an example of both the constructivist emphasis on how identity can be built and the instrumentalist logic that political elites can precipitate identity politicization and conflict. Indeed, the difference between Hutu and Tutsi was not actually as distinct until the colonial period, when the Belgians used this distinction to separate out the groups and put the Tutsis in control as a method of consolidating their own control over Rwanda. Thus, the colonial experience helped construct and strengthen these identities, and the minority Tutsi group was favored and the majority Hutu group excluded. Following Rwandan independence and an enormous population boom, which made it one of the most densely populated countries in Africa, there was great competition over scarce land, and there were plenty of feelings of relative deprivation to go around, especially on the part of the majority Hutus who were so long excluded. There was a civil war in the years before the genocide, followed by a very shaky peace, which was broken when the Hutu leadership stoked fears that helped spark a group of Hutus to begin the atrocious act of genocide. We see here that intergroup conflict can result in unspeakable human devastation and loss of life. Obviously, the topic of political conflict, be it nasty campaigning or full-blown war and even genocide, is an enormous area of academic study. Today we've touched on just a few of the relevant theories, but hopefully this has given you a general framework to think about intergroup conflict. Hopefully this might also lead you to reflect upon your own opinions and emotions. Do you feel that your group is deprived by another, or do you feel a sense of fear and anger at another group that can be used by self-serving political elites?
Now they're tearing up holes in the house, and they're tearing their claws right through